All right, so, speaking English well, especially when it's not your first language, it can feel kind of daunting, right? Like, how do you get past that fear and actually become a confident speaker? We're diving into that today.
You hit the nail on the head, that fear factor. What's interesting about the stuff we've got to work with is, yeah, it gets into the nitty-gritty of pronunciation and all that, but it really zeroes in on mindset.
Yeah.
That's often the missing piece, you know?
Totally. I mean, there's a reason why they say things like mind over matter, right? So how does that apply to something as practical as speaking another language?
Well, it starts with how you view those inevitable stumbles, the mistakes everyone makes, especially when learning.
Oh, tell me about it. I've had my fair share of grammatical train wrecks.
See, that's what most people fear, right?
Huh.
But this material suggests we flip the script. What if, instead of dreading those mess ups, we saw them as, like, data points?
Data points. I
Yeah.
like the sound of that. Like each mistake is just information about what to tweak next time.
Exactly. It's a less intimidating way to look at it, right? And that ties into this whole growth mindset thing they keep talking about.
Which, by the way, I've noticed is huge EE in the language learning world these days. Growth mindset over, like, being a natural.
Makes sense, though, when you think about it. If you believe you can improve, your brain's actually more wired to do just that. So being okay with being a work in progress, that's where the magic happens.
Funny you should mention that because one thing I always struggle with is pronunciation. I can read those textbook rules till the cows come home, but then I hear someone actually speaking naturally.
Right. And it's like a whole different ball game. That's where immersing yourself in the real deal comes in, which the material really emphasizes. Podcasts, shows, even audiobooks are like free pronunciation masterclasses.
And this is where that shadowing technique comes in, right? I'll be honest, I've always thought of it as something like hardcore language nerds do. Is it
Yeah.
really that effective for the average person?
It might feel weird at first, I'll grant you that. But picture it this way. You're basically borrowing the voice of a native speaker, mimicking their intonation, rhythm, all that stuff that makes speech sound natural, not like a robot.
So it's like you're their vocal shadow, literally trying to match their every inflection.
Exactly. And as you're shadowing, you're training your ear to pick up those little things that textbooks just can't capture.
Wow, that's actually a really cool way to think about it. And it makes sense because when you think about it, you can know how a word should sound, but actually making your mouth do it smoothly is a whole other story.
Right. And speaking of things that can feel overwhelming, let's talk about vocabulary. Those massive word lists talk about intimidating.
Ugh, don't even get me started. I swear I've spent hours cramming vocabulary only to completely blank in an actual conversation.
Yeah.
Like, what's the point of knowing a word if you can't use it in the wild, you know?
I hear you. And that's why this whole contextual learning thing is so key. And the material talks about that a lot. It's not about just cramming your brain. It's about learning words that are relevant to your life, how you want to use English.
So it's about finding the words that'll empower you to talk about the things you're passionate about rather than memorizing the dictionary. That makes sense.
Right. It's about making language learning meaningful. And this ties into another point. The material makes learning words within phrases or sentences, not just in isolation.
Because let's be real, nobody walks around just spouting random words, right? We use them in sentences.
Exactly. So instead of just learning delicious, you might learn this cake is absolutely delicious. You're not just learning the word, you're internalizing a chunk of language that just flows naturally.
It's like you're learning the music of the language, not just the individual notes. I love that.
Exactly. And speaking of music, let's talk about fluency. This is the holy grail for most learners, but it can feel so elusive.
Tell me about it. I'll have those moments where I feel like I'm in the zone, then bam, grammar wall. Yeah. Or it completely blank on a word, and it's like all my progress just vanished.
And that's where this reframe from the materials really helps. Fluency is a marathon, not a sprint. It's about consistency, not about speaking perfectly right out of the gate.
So all those times I've stumbled over verb tenses or forgotten a word mid-sentence, that doesn't mean I'm not on the path to fluency.
Not at all. Even native speakers make little grammatical errors sometimes. What matters more is being able to communicate your message, keep the conversation going, connect with the person you're talking to.
That's actually really encouraging to hear. So it's about just starting to speak, even if it feels messy and imperfect at first.
Exactly. And the material talks about making English as much a part of your daily life as possible, even when you're not actively studying. Think about it. You didn't learn your native language by memorizing grammar rules, right? You absorbed it through constant exposure.
Okay, but that's easier said than done when you don't live in an English-speaking country. How do I make that happen?
Get creative, talk to yourself in English, narrate your day, think in English if you can. Every little bit adds up.
Those are actually really great practical tips. And speaking of things that sound counterintuitive, this next point from the material threw me for a loop at first.
Let me guess, are we talking about active listening?
You nailed it. It seems odd, right? We're talking about speaking, but the material really emphasizes the importance of listening. Why is that?
Because it's not just about passively hearing words, right? Active listening is about engaging with them, paying attention to the speaker's tone, their body language, those subtle cues that add layers of meaning.
So it's like being a detective trying to piece together all those clues to really understand what the speaker's trying to get across.
Exactly. And here's the cool part. The more you do this, the more attuned you become to the nuances of spoken English. You start picking up on those subtle cues that native speakers use without even realizing it.
That's so true. And speaking of things we might not realize we're doing, body language. The material talks about that too, right? It's like you can say the perfect words, but if your body's sending a different message.
It's a recipe for disaster.
Yeah.
Imagine you're hunched over, avoiding eye contact, fidgeting like crazy, your body screaming, "I don't want to be here," even if your words are saying, "Hello, nice to meet you."
Oh my gosh, yes. That's hilarious, but so true. So posture, eye contact, all that good stuff. It matters more than we think, huh?
Big time. Projecting confidence through body language, even if you don't feel 100% confident on the inside. And it's not just about avoiding bad habits either. Native speakers, they're expressive with their hands, their faces. It's like another layer of communication on top of their words.
So we should be more mindful of our own body language and maybe even try to be more expressive ourselves, even if it feels unnatural at first.
Exactly. And here's where things get really interesting. Not all body language is universal. Culture plays a huge role, which the material also dives into.
Oh, right. Like, what might be a friendly gesture in one culture could be totally offensive in another.
Right. Direct eye contact, for example. In some cultures, it's a sign of respect. But in others, it can come across as aggressive, especially if there's a power dynamic at play.
Wow, that's such an important reminder that effective communication goes way beyond just the words we choose.
100%. And speaking of words we choose, let's talk about those pesky idioms. They can really trip up non-native speakers.
Don't even get me started on idioms. I once tried to use the phrase piece of cake to describe something easy to a friend from Japan, and she looked at me like I had two heads.
That's classic. Idioms are so deeply ingrained in a culture's language, we often don't even realize we're using them.
So how do we even begin to tackle them? Should we just be memorizing lists of common expressions?
That can be helpful to a point, but the material suggests a more organic approach. Instead of memorizing the literal meaning, try to understand the context in which it's used.
So pay attention to how native speakers are using those idioms in real life, in movies, TV shows, all those things we talked about earlier.
You got it. And here's a trick. When you come across an idiom you don't get, don't just look up the definition. Try to figure it out from the context. It's like a little language puzzle.
So put on my detective hat again. That actually makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
If I can figure it out from the situation, I'm way more likely to remember it.
Exactly. And speaking of things we often try to figure out, grammar. I know for many learners, this is the scariest part of all.
Oh, tell me about it.
Yeah.
I spent years trying to memorize verb tenses and sentence structures, and honestly, it didn't really translate to me speaking more fluently. It was exhausting.
And that's because grammar, just like vocabulary and idioms, is best learned in context. Think about when you were a kid learning your first language. You didn't memorize grammar rules, did you?
Absolutely not. I don't even think I knew what a verb was until I was much older.
Exactly. You learned by listening, by experimenting, by making a ton of mistakes.
So you're saying we should treat English grammar like one big language puzzle?
I love that. It's about figuring out the rules by seeing how they're used in real life. Now, that doesn't mean grammar rules are useless. They can be helpful as a framework, but they shouldn't be the end-all be-all.
So instead of just memorizing the rules, we should be looking for patterns, trying to understand how grammar actually works in the real world.
That makes it seem a lot less intimidating, actually.
Right. And the more you expose yourself to natural English reading, listening, speaking, the more intuitive it all becomes. Grammar will start to feel less like a set of rules and more like a natural part of communication.
Exactly.
It's like learning to dance. You can read all the books you want about footwork and rhythm, but until you get out there and start moving to the music, it's not going to click.
Okay, that's a great analogy. But speaking of getting out there and moving, What about speaking anxiety? I think that's a huge hurdle for a lot of people, myself included. Even just thinking about speaking English in front of native speakers can make my palms sweat. You're definitely not alone. It's incredibly common. Even experienced speakers often get nervous. The material actually makes this interesting point. A lot of that anxiety comes from this fear of being judged, of not sounding perfect.
Which makes sense, right? I mean, we want to sound good, and making mistakes can feel like we're failing somehow.
Exactly. And the thing is, that fear can become a self-fulfilling prophecy. When we're so worried about messing up, we're actually more likely to mess up. It's crazy.
Oh, tell me about it. I've totally blanked on simple words, even grammar rules, just because I was overthinking everything in the moment. My brain just goes to mush.
It's like that fight or flight response, right? Our brains think threat, and we either freeze up or try to escape.
So how do we break out of that cycle? Because telling myself to just calm down never seems to work when I'm actually in that situation.
I know, calm down is the worst advice, right? But thankfully, there are more practical things we can try. One thing this material talks about is shifting your focus.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Shift my focus from what? To what? Give me the specifics.
So instead of fixating on your own performance, am I making mistakes? Do I sound weird? Try shifting that focus to the message itself. What do you want to say? Who are you speaking to? What kind of connection are you trying to build?
So it's about getting out of your head, being more present, more focused on the other person, which actually kind of relates back to that active listening thing we were talking about earlier, right?
Exactly. It's all connected. When we're truly present, engaged in the conversation, we tend to be less anxious because we're not stuck in our own heads overthinking every little thing.
I can see that. It's like the pressure's off a little because it's not all about me, me, me. It's about the shared experience of communicating.
Exactly. And the material also mentions some other helpful things, deep breathing exercises, positive self-talk. But I think the biggest takeaway for me was this. It's okay to be nervous.
Wait, really? We should be okay with feeling anxious. That seems kind of counterintuitive.
Think about it. That nervousness often comes from a place of excitement,
Wow.
caring about doing well. It means you're challenging yourself, and that's a good thing.
I like that reframing. So it's not about eliminating anxiety altogether. It's more about seeing it as a normal, even helpful part of the process.
Right. It's like saying, okay, I'm a little nervous, but that means I'm about to do something that matters to me. And that brings us to another point that really stuck with me, this idea of authenticity in speaking. Because I feel like sometimes when we're so focused on being correct, we can lose ourselves a bit.
Oh, I know what you mean. It's like trying to fit ourselves into this perfect English speaker box, and we end up sounding robotic instead of letting our personalities come through.
Exactly. And the material really hammers this home authenticity is just as important as accuracy, especially when it comes to connecting with others.
So it's okay to have an accent, to make a few mistakes here and there, maybe even throw in a quirky idiom now and then as long as we're being genuine.
100%. In fact, those little imperfections often make us more memorable, more relatable. Because, let's face it, perfect grammar can be kind of boring.
Totally.
Yeah.
We connect with people on a deeper level when they're being real, not trying to be someone they're not. And speaking of letting go of perfection, the material also talks about embracing mistakes as learning opportunities.
Right. It all circles back to that growth mindset. Instead of beating ourselves up for mistakes, what if we saw them as valuable feedback?
So changing that internal dialogue, right? Instead of
Yeah.
thinking, ugh, I messed up again, it's more like, okay, what can I learn from this? How can I do better next time?
Exactly. The material even suggests keeping a mistake journal. Every time you make a mistake, write it down along with the correct way to say it. That way you're turning those mistakes into tools.
I love that idea. It's like instead of those mistakes just haunting me, I'm turning them into something I can actually use to improve.
Exactly. It's about taking control. And that leads us to another crucial aspect of becoming a confident speaker that the material emphasizes over and over: practice.
Yeah, there's no getting around that, is there?
Nope. But here's the good news. Practice doesn't have to be boring. It can be fun, even a little silly.
Okay, now you've got my attention. Fun and silly are not words I usually associate with language practice. Tell me more.
Well, one suggestion was having English-only activities with friends or other learners.
Oh, like an English-only movie night?
Mm.
Or maybe trying to cook a meal together using only English, even if we have to look up every other word in the recipe.
Exactly. It's a low-pressure way to practice, and you're so caught up in the activity itself, it doesn't feel like studying.
I love that. It takes the pressure off.
Right. And the material also talks about finding small ways to use English in your everyday life, even just for a few minutes each day.
So things like ordering a coffee in English, even if the barista speaks my native language, or chatting with a tourist who looks lost.
Exactly. It all adds up. The more you do it, the more natural it becomes. And speaking of doing things that feel scary, don't be afraid to put yourself out there, mistakes and all.
Because mistakes are our friends, right? At least that's what I keep telling myself.
That's the spirit. Every mistake is a chance to learn something. And the more comfortable you get with making mistakes, the less scary it all seems.
It's like the more you practice, the more you realize that it's not about being perfect. It's about being able to actually communicate.
Exactly. And as you continue practicing, challenging yourself, you'll have more and more of those moments where you surprise yourself, where the words just flow. You'll start to internalize those grammar rules, develop your own way of speaking English.
And that's what it's all about, right? Finding your own voice and using it to share your story with the world.
It's so true. And you've actually reminded me of something else. The material digs into this idea that language learning isn't just about like individual words and grammar. It's
Yeah.
about connecting with a whole culture, a different way of life.
Right? It's like you're not just learning a new language, you're learning a new way to see the world.
Yeah.
I even read somewhere that learning English can actually change your brain, literally rewiring it.
Isn't that wild? There's been research on this. Apparently, people who speak multiple languages tend to be better problem solvers, more creative, even have better memories.
Wow, that's pretty amazing. So, by learning English, we're not just adding to our skill set, we're actually making our brains work better overall. I like that.
It's like a brain workout. And it's not just the cognitive stuff either. Think about the impact on your personal and professional life. New opportunities, connections with people from all over the world.
It's true. English really can open doors.
Yeah.
But speaking of challenges, what about those times when you feel stuck? Maybe you don't know any other English learners and it feels like you're going at it alone. Any advice for those situations?
That's real, that feeling of isolation. But luckily these days, there are so many ways to connect with other learners, even native speakers, online communities, language exchange apps.
Oh, right. Those are lifesavers when you don't have people to practice with in person.
For sure. And don't discount the value of a good language partner or tutor either. It's like having a personal guide on your language learning adventure.
I like that, a language Sherpa. Someone who's been there, done that, and can help you navigate the tricky parts. And speaking of navigating, one thing I found really helpful is setting goals. Like not just, I want to be fluent, but actual concrete steps I can take.
100%. That's something the material emphasizes too. Otherwise, it's easy to feel overwhelmed, like you're trying to climb Mount Everest without any gear.
Right, so instead of I want to be fluent, it's more like, this week I'm going to master these 5 irregular verbs.
Exactly. Small, achievable victories. And they talk about this too, making those goals SMART. Specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, time-bound.
Love it. And of course, none of that matters without consistency, right? Like, you can't just practice English once a month and expect to become fluent.
It's a marathon, not a sprint. This material stresses that a lot. Even just a little bit every day makes a huge difference over time.
It's about making it a habit, part of your routine, and finding what works for you. Not everyone learns the same way.
Exactly. Podcasts, movies, books, conversations, mix it up. The key is finding what you enjoy, what fits your life.
Because if you don't enjoy it, let's be real, you're not going to stick with it, no matter how much you want to learn.
So true. And that brings me to my final piece of advice, and I think it's the most important. Be kind to yourself. Learning a language, it's a journey with ups and downs. There will be days when you feel like you're killing it.
And days when you feel like you can barely string 2 words together.
Exactly. And it's in those moments of self-doubt that you've really got to remember how far you've come. Celebrate the wins, no matter how small they seem.
Because language learning, it's about so much more than just perfect grammar, right?
100%. It's about connecting with people, expressing yourself, seeing the world in new ways. It's a beautiful thing.
It really is. Well, I think that about wraps up our deep dive for today.
This was fantastic. I always love a good chat about language learning.
Me too. We covered a lot. Mindset, practice techniques, even a bit of brain science.
It's amazing how much there is to explore when it comes to language.
And this is really just the beginning, right? There's always more to learn, more to discover.
So true. To everyone listening, keep practicing, keep exploring, and never stop believing in yourself.
Until next time,